Hello and welcome to Peerlyst Community TV. I'm Frank Olhurst, your host today, and we're going to talk about the specter of unpatched firmware, and more specifically, the security dangers associated with the good old PC BIOS. My guest expert is Xeno Kovah, a member of the Peerlyst community and the co-founder of LegbaCore. Xeno is an expert in firmware security and can offer us some much-needed advice on firmware security issues. Hi, Xeno, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's good to talk to you.
Great. Did I pronounce everything correctly? It's LegbaCore, and your last name is Kovah?
Yep, that's correct.
Okay, great. Just wanted to make sure that we had that correct before we went any further. Now, very little thought's given to firmware security. What are the unrealized threats associated with firmware?
Well, I think one of the biggest problems is that a lot of times people get confused about the difference between hardware and firmware. So whereas hardware attacks are relatively expensive and pretty difficult to pull off, firmware attacks are pretty cheap in comparison, and at the end of the day, they're really just software attacks. And that means all the same things that a normal software attacker can do, attack you remotely over the network, that kind of thing, it's all possible with firmware attacks. But with firmware attacks. The difference is software attacks. The difference between firmware attacks and software attacks is essentially that firmware attacks, they live at the lowest level of the software stack. They're basically the first software that ever actually runs on the system. And that means they have to be the most privileged, the most powerful. They can compromise, manipulate, modify any other software that runs afterwards on the system. So that's one big difference from normal software attack. And the second thing is no one's looking essentially down at the firmware level. So people typically go down to the operating system level, but they don't really know what to do after that. There's this perspective that things are also system specific and that sort of thing, but that's really not the case anymore. There's a lot of shared code down at the firmware level these days.
So what type of firmware are we talking about here?
So the work that we've done on firmware has been primarily PC BIOS firmware, like you mentioned, but the reality is there's been a lot of other work done by other researchers which is focused on firmware on hard drives, on network cards, on keyboard controllers. And so basically modern PCs kind of look like a network of a whole bunch of little computers all talking to each other. And so each of them has firmware and each of them is sort of going unchecked, and it's a black box that's out of sight, out of mind.
What's the first thing someone should do to eliminate these potential security problems?
We always say that the most important thing for people to do is basically to find and apply any firmware patches from the vendors. So over the past couple of years, we've actually found a lot of vulnerabilities, exploitable bugs, things like that, down at the firmware level on PC BIOSes. And we're finding increasingly that it turns out that those same vulnerabilities apply to Macs just as well as PCs. So we always say, apply the firmware patches that the vendor make, because we went out and we worked with the firmware vendors to get them to fix these things, but it's all for naught if people don't actually apply those patches to their systems. Otherwise, the attacker can just come along and use that knowledge and attack you.
So can these firmware-related security problems pretty much go unnoticed? People never realize that something has happened?
Yeah, I think for the most part, the reason an attacker would actually go after the firmware is because they know that that's a place no one checks. They know there's not a lot of security tools out there. They know that corporations don't do patch management, and therefore any old bugs that happen to have ever been found can still be exploited on some system. So yeah, basically our expectation is if an attacker goes down to attack the firmware level, it's specifically because they want to go unnoticed. And information out there on the net has shown that it's been proved that nation-state attackers that work at this level have gone unfound for years, if not decades on end.
Wow. So what are some of the best practices our viewers out there should consider to protect from these problems?
Yeah, so like I mentioned before, we always think the first and most important thing is patch management, because that's the simplest way. Vendors have been getting much better over the past couple of years as new vulnerabilities come to light. It basically makes it so that they realize, okay, this is getting to be a problem. Attackers are learning how this works. It's a little too easy, and they've been incentivized to start patching things. So that's the first order thing. But second order things that can be done involve, determining for yourself, for the machines in your enterprise or for your personal machine, does it have any vulnerabilities? And there's actually a couple of tools out there that are useful for that. There's one which is Copernicus, which is a project that we worked on at our previous job and which is linked to on our website. Copernicus can tell you, is your BIOS actually vulnerable? Like, is it just straight up unlocked and the vendor didn't put any access control on it? Or is it vulnerable because there's a known exploit bug in it? And Copernicus can also do integrity checking, and that's kind of another thing that we think people should do. It's basically, dump the contents of your BIOS. It's very much similar to sort of forensics on a hard drive or integrity checking type security software. You basically just want to dump your BIOS, the contents of the firmware, and say, does this match the clean version that the BIOS vendors put out on their website, right? So they give you patches that you can download, that kind of thing. That gives you a clean version for you to actually compare against. And in our previous work, we had actually done integrity checking and vulnerability checking for more than 10,000 enterprise production systems, and it all went very easily. The last sort of best practice that I would mention is there's been news reports about some countries actually doing attacks on travelers coming into and out of their country, and so oftentimes, if people are taking their business laptops on business travel, there's the potential for it to be sort of, you go out, you go to your trip, and then you come back and you have this low-level firmware bug installed that you're not actually looking for. So implementing a sort of program where you check stuff on the way out and you check it on the way back in, that's a good way to potentially find any sort of physical attacks that might have taken place as someone's been overseas, for instance.
Wow, that sounds like very sage advice. Thanks for that information, Xeno, and thanks for joining us today.
I appreciate talking to you. Have a good day.
Thank you again, and that's all we have for today. Thanks for watching. For those seeking more information on firmware security, please be sure to visit the blogs at peerlyst.com, and don't forget to take a look at the LegbaCore product page, and be sure to follow Xeno on Peerlyst. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for watching. Thank you again, Xeno.
Thanks. Have a good day. Bye.